Welcome and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this event in the Germinations seminar series in environmental humanities in Latin America. My name is Paul Merchant. I teach Latin American studies and environmental humanities at the University of Bristol, and along with Jamila Pinheiro Diaz and Ainhoa Montoya from the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, and Lisa Blackmore from the University of Essex. I'm one of the co-conveners of the Germinations series. Now, it is a very great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this event on a decade of Eduardo Kohn's How Forests Think, which is a really seminal text in Latin American environmental humanities and anthropology. It's a book that I use all the time with my students and that generates lots of really interesting responses. And I'm sure many of you in this group today will have had similar experiences. So we're here with a panel including Eduardo himself. Thank you, Eduardo, for joining us, and two of the translators to think about the translation and the circulation of Eduardo's text and his ideas and the collaborations that he's been involved in a decade on from the publication. So the structure of today's session, we're going to have short initial presentations from Eduardo first, and then from Mónica Cuéllar, Gempeler, and then from Jamila Pinheiro Diaz. I'll introduce each of them in turn, and then we will have plenty of time. So each of those initial presentations will last around 10 minutes. So we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions and thoughts after that. Just a brief note before we start to say that this session is being recorded. So just to be aware of that, so you can consider whether or not you want your face to be preserved for posterity on the recording. I can see someone just decided they didn't, which is great. And this includes the discussion afterwards. So if you want to ask a question, you can of course unmute and pose it orally, but you can also put it in the chat, send it to me as a message if you'd prefer to ask your question that way. So without further ado, let me introduce, well, he doesn't really need an introduction, but I will introduce Eduardo Kohn to you, who is Associate Professor and Anthropology for the Ecozoic Lead at McGill University in Montreal. He is, as we all know, the author of How Forests Think, Toward an Anthropology Beyond the Human, which received the 2014 Gregory Bateson Award for Best Book in Anthropology. And Kohn's work, as we know, seeks to take the social sciences beyond the limits of strictly human relations. So in this book, he proposes that all life forms, not only humans, engage in processes of signification. He's currently working on a new project, Forest for the Trees, which argues that a forest, that highly absential, and he put this in inverted commas, emergent product of a vast network of non-human semiosis, is a real thing. A forest is a real thing and not merely a human abstraction. So Eduardo, thanks very much for being here with us, and over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. What a real treat and a pleasure. So wonderful to get to know some of you. Hopefully I can get to know more of you on in the discussion. Monica, of course, translated How Forests Think into Spanish, which was a really long process. Took us several years. She's a former PhD student of mine and now a professor in Bogota. Jamila, I met in Princeton several years ago, and this wonderful process of translating the book into Portuguese got underway, of course, a little delayed by COVID, as so many things have been. So it's really great. I thought I'd just spend a few minutes. Let me just try to mark the time because I don't want to take up too much time. I want to spend a few minutes talking about just translation, both from the nitty-gritty on into, how I think of the practice of anthropology as a form of translation. So maybe I'll start with the nitty-gritties of that. The book has been translated into several languages. I think it's 10 or 11. The first translation was of one chapter, but in book form, into Danish, which was a really beautiful edition. I can't say much about anything about the actual content of the translation, but the chapter that was chosen was the chapter on soul blindness, chapter 3. And that's an interesting as a standalone chapter because it's probably maybe the most, I mean, not that the book is particularly narrative, but it's the most standalone chapter. It's the most narrative chapter. In some sense, it's the easiest to understand. That was followed, if memory serves, by a Japanese translation through a network of colleagues, of people that I knew that were doing it, and was, I think, done as a team. I don't remember exactly the order, but one of the big, I think Korean came quickly after that. I didn't have much to do with that. Then French, and that was an interesting translation because it was done by a colleague of mine and a friend, Gregory de Laplace, an anthropologist who was then at Nanterre. And he that became a very serious endeavor, a collaborative endeavor, because of the seriousness of the translator as an anthropologist, and also the fact that I have some knowledge of French, so we could discuss the translation together. That was followed by, I believe, if I remember correctly, the Spanish translation, where we were very closely. Spanish was my first language, although I've never formally had an education in Spanish, but it was my first language. So that became a very interesting process with Mónica. I had initially approached Mónica about the possibility of her translating the book years ago, and then we both decided that that would not be such a good idea because we were worried it would get in the way of her studies. But as she was completing her PhD and kind of her PhD was largely written, it seemed like it might make sense to do it. And she can tell us more about the process, but I think it was really a meaningful and fruitful process. One of the really interesting things about that translation is that since the book was written, I've done more research in Ecuador. As Paul was saying, I've been involved in new projects, a new book project, which is also a kind of translation. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I've developed a very strong, close, and special collaboration with an Amazonian shaman, or political and spiritual leaders, he calls himself, named Manari Ushigwa. And my collaboration with him was begun because of the reputation that my book had, even before it was published into Spanish. Once it was published into Spanish, we asked him to write something, and he and I decided we would actually have a prologue. We would write a prologue as a dialogue, and a lot of that prologue is also kind of in some sense a theory of translation, a theory of reading. What it is to what in some sense he was transmitting back, perhaps translating the reception this book has had in the world of the spirits, and what it is, and what how it is that a book like this, how a book like this can be read and understood through the translation of dreaming. So for him, towards the end of that preface, he talks about, this is a dense, if anyone has engaged with this book, it's a very dense book and frustrating in many ways. Not because of anything that Mónica did. Although it's, in some ways, I spent a lot of time trying to write it clearly. And what's quite interesting, this is a digression, and I'll get back to the story of Manari. There are several times, a few times in the French translation and several times in the Spanish translation where Mónica was really stumped, just couldn't figure out how to translate things, and can't remember which passages these are. Time and again, when that happened, there was a logical problem in the English one. It's poorly written in English, and then, obviously we have to fix it in the Spanish. So in some ways, these translations can be better than the originals. But Manari was saying something about how if this book, you might read it once and not understand it, second time and not understand it, but in the third time, it can become clear. He also thinks of books, and this has become very important for me in my current work, as something like written children. They're like gods, and you have to sort of nurture them. They have a life. For Manari, concepts are like gods, and books house concepts. They're the kinds of spirits that we ourselves create. and they're on par with the other kinds of spirits that we don't create. They live, they have a life beyond, but they have to be nurtured and interpreted. So I think it'd be interesting to discuss those ideas, and maybe we can talk more about that. That preface, of course, is not in the English version, but it's in the Spanish one. It's also in the Italian one. The Italian translators are a team of philosophers, kind of anarchist philosophers, who also have been translating Davi Kopinawa and know Davi Kopinawa. So I think that was also interesting, given Jamila's work, her doctoral work with Davi Kopinawa's work. There's a kind of confluence here, this idea of translation, but also working with shamans who are consummate translators, as are anthropologists. And, of course, it's an obvious truth that, translating is not like, it's not something where you have a one-to-one mapping between one word and another. Translating is really is about how to get systems of ideas to fit, and also how to maintain some of the iconic and indexical resonances that one finds in the original, but in another register. So it's a real art, yeah, I just want to say one more thing before I close. My current work that Paul referred to, I'm actually now writing a book that's intended for a larger audience, intended for, one might say a popular audience. I'm not exactly sure what that means, and I don't know that kind of readership exists in English. My book certainly, I'm not sure yet how. I don't have a great sense of the reception in Spanish yet, but certainly in French and Italian, it's understood there as a kind of a popular book, in the sense that it's in a certain register of popular culture, and there's a tolerance for things that are a little bit more sort of conceptual in those reading cultures. Be curious to see what happens with the Brazilian translation, if it's like that. This last few weeks, a translation has come out in German, and I think Chinese as well. And I think those are basically it. I forget, I think I may have missed some, but it's around 10 or 11 translations. But my current project is also a kind of translation. And it's interesting because this book is being written, it's under contract with a few presses, and English-speaking presses and also foreign language presses simultaneously. And what's an interesting challenge for me, and I think it's quite difficult for some of the English publishers who are, who really want, who are very interested in the bottom line of sales, is how do you say something about this world I'm talking about in a way that's true to it, that distorts people's expectations in the good, defamiliarizes our sense of the world, but that doesn't lose people. And I also am interested in other kinds of translation in this book, because I'm very interested in the standard kind of anthropological work, of ethnographic work, of saying, hey, this is how things happen in this particular world, in this case, the Amazonian world and the world of the forest and the people who live there. But I'm also interested in how that kind of resonates with me, the kind of phenomenological experience of how I come to experience that. But I want to do more in this book because I want you to feel it, you, the reader. And that requires a kind of attention to literary form that hopefully, if I can pull it off, and I'm not sure I can because, I'm not a professional writer, I'm a professional anthropologist who also writes. I want you, the reader, to be able to make the story through your own connecting the pieces. But the other point, so I've kind of, the book is doing this movement between telling what's out there, reporting it, giving you the experience, the first person of experience of seeing it. But the other register, which is also very difficult for me and difficult for my publishers, is that I also am interested in a kind of formalist account. That is, not just telling something about what goes on in the forest and why it matters from a kind of descriptive point of view or an experiential or story-driven point of view, but also giving a formal account that is not necessarily passing through or circumscribed by any one particular group of actors or cultures. And for me, that requires, talking about registers like biology and semiotics, and even a little bit of things like mathematics and things like that, and making an argument that that is not bounded within a culture. Anyways, we can develop some of those ideas a little more if people are interested. So just to conclude, I mean, I see the act of translation that is done with, from linguistic worlds to linguistic worlds as similar to, but not really, similar to anthropology, moving around among cultures, and also similar to shamanism, the movement from different worlds. And for Manati, that major movement is between the spirit world and the everyday world. But I think we have to be careful because in some sense, when we think of translation in writing, we're talking about movements between strictly, relatively speaking, strictly symbolic worlds, from one symbolic world to another. And the symbolic world, in the sense that I use the idea of the symbol in the Persian sense, of a system of conventional and arbitrary signs that have to be, in which the mapping has to go from system to system. And yet, translation, quote unquote, from shamanic world to everyday world is really something else. It's about other forms of communication. Often it's about generalities to specifics, absential things to presential things. Doesn't quite have the same logic as language to language. And I would say that the anthropological or ethnographic translation, especially in a kind of anthropology, quote unquote, beyond the human that I'm interested in, also doesn't fully work because we're not moving between cultures. And yet there's something about translation in all of those. And I think that would be fun to explore in this conversation. Anyways, I'll leave my comments at that, and really looking forward to hearing from all of you and from the presenters. Well, so.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, for setting the scene for us so elegantly, and setting out some of those the different registers and kinds of translation that are at stake in this work. And even if, as you say, when we think about translation from one written language to another, it is simpler in the sense that we're moving from one kind of system of signs, a sort of symbolic register, to another. Nonetheless, I think your evocation of the very different reading cultures and indeed writing cultures that accompany those languages makes it by no means a straightforward task. I was just trying to imagine. I was just thinking about the Chinese translation and quite what that might involve there in terms of the different sorts of symbols involved. Okay, so we're going to move to one of those particular writing and reading cultures then. We're next going to hear from Mónica Cuéllar Gempeler, who's assistant professor of anthropology at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogotá. Her research, which is focused on rural areas of the Colombian Andes, inquires into processes of mourning, absence, and narrative in relation to rural migration. And she is the co-translator of the Spanish version of How Forests Think, which is titled Cómo piensan los bosques, hacia una antropología más allá de lo humano, which she co-translated with Belén Agustina Sánchez and is published by Hecht Libros in 2021. Mónica, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Jamile, for the invitation. Such a pleasure to be here, to see Eduardo. It always makes me really happy, and to see so many people connected, hearing us. So I'm very happy to be here, very happy to have this moment to think about, to reflect on these different but also related processes of translation, and to think through the pages of How Forests Think and of its Latin American version, or perhaps I should say the first Latin American version that was published in Spanish in 2021, Cómo piensan los bosques, as Paul was saying, which I was very lucky to be able to help with. When I started working on this translation, I was writing my PhD dissertation at McGill. Both the translation and the dissertation took shape with the generous and close guidance of Eduardo. And even though translating how forests think is certainly a difficult challenge, it was also a pleasure and an inspiration, and sometimes even a real relief when I was lost in my own writing, to be able to lose myself in the words of this book, to study its ways, the way it beautifully flows from theory to ethnographic description to history, all the while cultivating, as Eduardo says in these pages, a kind of sylvan thinking that, as Manari Ushigwa says in the prologue of the book in Spanish, grows when we dream. As Eduardo was saying just a little moment ago, so I'm going to be, I think, following, I'm very in tune with his words. It's at the end of the prologue in the book in Spanish that Manari Ushigwa mentions this. As Eduardo was saying, Manari is leader of the Zapata Nation in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And he mentions this following a meditation on the possibility of cultivating thoughts that remain open to further growth. I want to quote his words, and it's the same little bit that Eduardo was mentioning. So I think it'll be nice to hear them in Spanish, although I will also try to put them in English. It might be a little bit clumsy, but just to give you an idea. Manari is saying that we are used to finishing our thoughts with conclusions that close things up. But then he continues and says that, on the contrary, here in How Forests Think, poco a poco nos estamos abriendo. Con este libro nos estamos abriendo nuevamente, poco a poco. We are opening up bit by bit. With this book, we are opening up again, little by little. Manari is here speaking to Eduardo. He says, has encontrado la manera de concluir, pero con ideas generales que mantienen el pensamiento abierto. You have found a way to reach a conclusion, but with general ideas that keep thinking open. And that's when Manari writes the words that I was just thinking about. He says, and that Eduardo was just mentioning as well. He says, así la gente irá leyendo y leyendo, y poco a poco entendiendo y entendiendo este libro. Al principio van a pensar que es difícil de entender, pero seguirán leyendo, y a la tercera lectura los pensamientos harán que los lectores empiecen a soñar, y así estas ideas tomarán vida. People will read once and then once more, and little by little they will understand the book each time a bit better. At first, they'll think it's difficult to understand, but they will keep on reading. And by the third reading, these thoughts will make readers begin to dream, and that's how these ideas will come to life. So we close this book as an opening into a dream that in turn brings its thoughts to life. And when you close this particular book, you really do get a sense of the dream that opens to the broader living world with the image that feels more like a vision in the art of the cover that was made by Ecuadorian artist Paula Barragán. And Manari Ushigwa's prologue and Paula Barragán's art, they certainly make this book vibrate in unique ways. And I can only hope that the actual translated words do justice to the original work, of course, but also to all the beauty and the wisdom that envelop them. Because, and I'm sure this is a shared experience with Jamila and with all other translators of the book, it was not easy to find the right words and rhythm to move through the different kinds of tones and modes of writing that flow in this book, perhaps laboriously at first from the viewpoint of a new reader, but then also effortlessly, as Manari says in his Oneric meditation, or as Eduardo says in the book about being inside an emerging form in the forest of the Ecuadorian Amazon. For the Spanish translation, this particular location of the events was important. The language had to respond to this Ecuadorian context to which this Latin American version is in part, I think, meant to return. The Spanish we used, it had to have, so to say, a neutral Latin American accent And at certain points, it needed to assume the way it sounds specifically in Ecuador. But I myself am not Ecuadorian, and my very Colombian choice of words often crept into the text. And Eduardo was there to sense it when it felt out of place. And the wonderful Cristina Yepes, who is from Ecuador, she's a doctoral student at McGill, and she's also a translator. She was there to help us find alternatives to name, for example, a dirt road or a bird or a hot beverage or a particular kind of dog. It was a sensorial work of feeling the sound of words, which is always so important for any writing practice, but I think especially for a process of translation, and particularly for a kind of translation like this one that was finding its way back to one of the main places of its inception. And this also charged the work with a sense of responsibility, the sense of a kind of needed return. And I have felt this need fulfilled, especially when I have taught, like Paul, when I have taught this book in anthropology classes with indigenous students from the Colombian Amazon. I remember one class where all the rest of us, we were very urban readers, and we were struggling to understand the ontological shift that the book enacts in us. But there was one indigenous student, her name is Yandrey. She's from the Wanano Cotiria people of the Vaupés riverbed in Colombia. And she said, desde lo que soy, no se me hace nada raro. It was something like, from where I stand or from who I am, I don't find it strange at all. And rather than explain, for instance, the difference and the nested entanglement between the symbolic and the iconic, she told us stories about blue butterflies that appear along the way in the forests of the Vaupés River, offering an image of possible paths through the thick forest with their movement. And she said that these butterflies are grandmothers from another day, de otro día, helping people find their way. It was something like that moment in the book where a bird flies by, a squirrel cuckoo, and two women from Avila hear it. Luisa and America listen to it. And while Luisa interprets it as a sonic image tracing the bird's ecological embedding, America hears it as a message and as an omen. Except here in the blue butterflies, I think the image and the message were entangled in one listening, a view of paths opening, and the message from life after death, from life in another day. And this is an image that makes me think of something else in the prologue of this Latin American version. It's when Eduardo says that had he written this book for the Avila Runa or for the Sarayaku Runa or for the people of the Zapara nation, he would have given it a different title. Because, as he says in this prologue, they already know very well how to think with forests and why. That day in class, it was very clear that yes, of course, they do already know. They know it intimately. They narrate it so eloquently. And young indigenous students like Yandrey are looking for ways and working to make it visible, to amplify that knowledge, while the rest of us, we had yet to find a way to fully hear what she is already saying, to hear it beyond the anecdote, to hear it along with the ecologies out of which grows this broader kind of thinking that can change us deeply, partly by connecting us with the dead, like the butterfly grandmothers de otro día, of another day, and also with the futures, the paths that they might help us find and that we might be able to be a part of if we break out of our human symbolic enclosures and attempt another kind of listening. The book offers this to us, so I'm very grateful to have it and to be one among its many translators, helping it reach places where, in a way, it is already resonating, cultivating living concepts that open into vital and oneric, another possible, already growing, and already threatened worlds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica, for that beautiful, very poetic reflection. I agree. We all bring our own sort of universe, don't we, to that moment of reading, to that encounter. We all read desde lo que somos, from who we are. And I guess one of the great challenge and the kind of magic of translation is that you have to kind of imagine where that is for your intended target audience. And that's the great kind of conjuring trick that a translator is asked to do. So for our final presentation, we're going to hear about another version of this, about, as Mónica alluded to, about the soon to arrive second Latin American translation of this, which is the Portuguese version, which is soon to be published in Brazil. And so to talk to us about that, we have Jamila Pinheiro Dias, who's the director of the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the University of London School of Advanced Study. There's 4 institutions all nested together there for you, where she also works as a lecturer. Jamille's studies involve environmental issues, Amazonian cultural production, indigenous arts, and translation studies in Latin America, with a focus on Brazil. And Jamille is the translator of the Portuguese version of How Forests Think, Como as Florestas Pensam, por uma antropologia além do humano, from Editora 34, which is soon to be published in Brazil. So over to you, Jamille.
Thank you so much, Bill, and good afternoon, good morning to all present. It's such an honor and a pleasure to virtually meet Eduardo again and to meet Mónica for the first time. And so I guess I would start by echoing Eduardo's point on the practice of anthropology as a mode of translation, and also thinking about the practice of translation as an anthropological endeavor. In a way, and I have said this in different contexts in the past, in relation to David Kopenawa's and Bruce Albert's book, translation is a way of dreaming outside of oneself. So with that in mind, How Forests Think does a wonderful translational job, serving as a bridge between different forms of thinking, language, and communication. And it goes even further by advocating for a broader anthropological project aimed at decolonizing thought itself. And by embracing this endeavor, How Forests Think encourages us to transcend human-centric perspectives on language. And I'm highlighting that because that has consequences for the practice of translation and how we can expand on our perception of the practice of translation, and really to engage with the world beyond our own species. So what happens when we think about the task of translation, if we push the boundaries of language itself and provincialize language, as Eduardo has so eloquently suggested? So it is really a question of, if we take seriously the idea of the interconnectedness between humans and non-humans in what concerns communication, and if we think about life itself and the dynamics of life from the point of departure of semiosis, if we redefine life itself as semiosis, as in the way Eduardo, conceptualizes according to the perceptions of the Runa people, then the very distinction between language and the world is to be challenged. And this has a lot to do, as I said, with this very intriguing idea of provincializing language, and in the way that it relocates language beyond the confines of the human domain. So I'm, as a translator and as someone who spends a significant time trying to build bridges across different epistemic regimes, I'm grateful to, for the opportunity to work on this book and its Brazilian translation, because I think it does offer wonderful conceptual tools for us to grasp the dynamics of life in a way that it enables a more comprehensive approach to language. So I'll just very briefly say a few words about, my initial encounter with Eduardo and my own positionality as an academic, but also as a translator. So my background is in modern languages, and I with a specific focus on Portuguese and English. But for approximately the last 15 years, I have been spending a significant portion of time in conversations with anthropologists. And throughout this time, the majority of the texts and books that I have translated have been offered by anthropologists. Initially, this is about the Brazilian context. Specifically, we were working on the reception of the work of anthropologists who conducted fieldwork primarily in Papua New Guinea, such as Marilyn Strader, Roy Wagner, Alfred Gell. Those are all anthropologists that I had the chance to translate. And then, with time, we were doing work on translating anthropologists who conducted field work in Melanesia because, people wanted to teach their work at university, and those texts were not available in Portuguese. But still, those works were relevant for Brazilian ethnologists who work in Amazonia and who were interested in thinking comparatively with specialists in Melanesia. But after that period, my translation efforts shifted towards Amazonists, including, of course, Eduardo Kohn, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, from Portuguese to English. And then Eduardo and I were at Princeton University attending a conference titled The Ends of Nature. And following the event, we maintained contact and proposed the book to Editora 34. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Brazilian publishing context, but it's a quite prominent publishing house in São Paulo, and they are responsible for publishing it, for publishing How Forests Think, Como as Florestas Pensam in Portuguese. So the process of translating a book can commence in various ways, but in this case, it originated from conversations in the context of this conference, right? Conversations between Eduardo and I. And due to various circumstances, and Eduardo has already mentioned that, including the impact of the pandemic, there have been delays. However, the translation manuscript is progressing well, and I'm preparing to submit it shortly to the publisher for the proofreading. And in the case of the Brazilian translation, Eduardo reached out to a specific individual to write the prologue. However, I won't share any details in order to maintain an element of surprise. And also, unlike the design for the book cover of Mónica's translation, well, the Brazilian book cover has not yet been chosen. So stay tuned for updates on this regard. And in relation to translation, I guess I could also say that it is a fact that, well, it requires great attention to detail. And because we have many academics with us in this Zoom room, I guess I would also add that it is unfortunate that translation is not sufficiently valued in most academic institutions to the extent that it truly deserves, given it really involves critical thinking. And so these days we have been talking a lot about how machine translation tools and artificial intelligence tools are advancing, and that I think has the danger of creating an illusion that mechanizing the process of transferring meaning from one language to another is enough. Eduardo has already touched a bit on translation going way beyond mere word-for-word substitution. So the position that I hold is that this craft still remains highly important, and it is so because, among other things, it involves a commitment with honoring the ontological dignity of the people that we translate, whose thinking we translate, both human and non-human. I think I see ourselves, Eduardo, Mónica, and myself, in the work that I do, as members in a chain of knowledge transmission, as we navigate epistemic nuances and build bridges across worlds. And for the sake of time, I would just mention one example of a particular challenge that I have encountered, in the process of the translation, and that I'm still consolidating, and that I think would be interesting to share. And that this challenge revolves around the term, as Mónica translated, runapuma, or in Grégory's translation, jaguar-anthrope. Initially, I had contemplated the idea of translating it in Portuguese as anthropo-onça, aligning with the strategy adopted in the French. However, I'm now leaning towards retaining runapuma due to considerations of accuracy and just the desire to honor the singularity of the concept being conveyed. But while runapuma, jaguar-anthrope, anthropo-onça are all valid and viable approaches. So yeah, just to share that, and thank you so much, Eduardo and Mónica, for joining us today, and really honored to be, part of, the efforts in making the reception of the book in Latin Jamaica happen, and expanding its readerships. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamila. And I think that last example you gave really kind of neatly crystallizes a lot of the complexity that our three speakers have alluded to in their wonderful presentations. So we do now have about 15 minutes for any questions, comments, discussion. So the floor is yours. I'd like to open up for any initial questions or comments. Feel free to raise a hand or just sort of go for it and unmute yourself, or put something in the chat. Or if people need a couple more minutes to gather their thoughts, I'll dive in with one kind of initial question. And this, well, I'd be interested to hear from any of you who'd like to answer it. So Eduardo very modestly said at the start that he wasn't a professional writer, but I kind of feel like all three of you are professional writers of one sort or another. I think, what's come through in all of the presentations is that translation it's an art, as Eduardo said. It's a creative act. It's a form of writing. So I'd be really interested to hear from any of you about what the process of translation of this work in particular, and from your kind of position in that collaboration, has it kind of made you reflect at all on your writing habits, your practices? How has it kind of influenced the other bits of writing or creative work that you do? So Eduardo, you already alluded to it. So kind of it had sort of clarified something that you hadn't felt was so clear ultimately in the original. But I wonder if there's other examples, or kind of from Jamila or Mónica, how it's kind of fed into other work that you do. I don't know who wants to go first on that. Mónica?
I can jump in. Yes, if that's okay.
Yeah,
because certainly, I mean, as I was saying, when I was doing the translation, I was also writing my dissertation. And the reason why it was a relief, it's because and also an inspiration, and the pleasure, as I was saying, is because I was finding ways ways to do things with language that make it break away a little bit from the symbolic, even while you're still in that register. It's something that was very important for the work I was doing, where the affective dimension of narrative was important. And I think this also speaks to, so I think this book is really, you can read it in so many different registers, as you know, for the theory or for the descriptions or for the stories, but also I think as a writing lesson, how to do this, how to move so fluently from one register to another, because the way the book breaks away from or one of the ways it shows us an alternative out of symbolic thinking is not only in the theory, but also in the movement between theory and ethnographic description. That each time you appreciate a little bit differently and more deeply, and then it really does make you dream differently. I remember this when I was doing the translation, my dreams were different. And so how do you do that with writing? Well, that's a big question. And I think when you're doing translation, that you have to be so deeply involved in the book that I could recite the book from memory. So you really get to learn from its shifts and its movements, and it's a real lesson, I think. Yeah, so a big influence for sure. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Mónica. Jamille.
Yeah, no, and I think that it's really interesting how the book also theorizes in the way that it ethnographically describes. So there's no like separation between the act of producing theory and the act of describing. And I think that has to do with its poetic and literary qualities. And something that really stayed with me was that in the initial, the moment when Eduardo and I met in the context of the Ends of Nature conference, he presented soundscapes. And I was thinking about those soundscapes when Mónica referred to, breaking away from the symbolic. So I think that sonic experience that Eduardo shared with us really stayed with me. So I'm always trying to get a sense of the sound that is part of the atmosphere of the book. I think that the book is very, there is a melody to it as well. And I think we can really separate the melody and the theory.
I was wondering if I could just jump in for a sec, because I think the thinking with translation also affects how I think about writing. Gregory de Laplace in the book launch for the French version said something really beautiful. He said, I have the distinctive, I play this distinctive role in which in this book I have written every single word, and yet I am the author of none of them. And this became very interesting to me as I began to do activist writing with communities in the Amazon. The first was working with the Sarayaku folks who had written a document about what they call the living forest, Kausaksacha, which is a vision of the rainforest as animate. Now, of course, anthropologists have been talking about this for a long time, and Amazonians, of course, have been talking about it for even longer. But this was one of the first instances in which Amazonians, as a political statement, were elevating this to the level of politics, and they were taking it specifically to the climate summit, the COP21 climate summit in Paris. This is 2015, and I was asked to help focus the work. It was an act of translation, conceptual, epistemological translation. The document had been written, and I in no way was the author, nor did I wish to be credited as the author. Would it have been appropriate? But there was an interesting debate in the community about who the author was, and it was between one of the kind of masterminds of this document, a very prominent community member, and the community itself, who said, no, it should not be an individual, it should be the community. And then, of course, the question was the question of who the author really is became clarified to me in my work with the Sáparas, in which it was very clear from the very beginning. And in that case, I was actually asked to write the document. I wrote a document. Sorry, I should just backtrack. The Sáparas and Manadi Ushigwa asked me, hearing of what happened with COP21, the document I'd written for the neighboring Sadayak folks, and also knowing about my book, he asked me to help him write a similar document, more experiential about what the forest has to say. And I would be the author in that sense. I wrote it with him, but I really did most of the actual putting words on paper. But I was not the author. It was very clear that the ideas would come from the forest. So this idea of translating and of sort of allowing yourself to be a conduit for something larger is a beautiful thing. And I think in some ways, translation is the most perfect form of writing in that sense. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through in the chat. The first one that came through from Dirk van Beckham, who is a clinical anthropologist. This one might be more for Eduardo, but well, anyone's welcome to answer. So it's asking about the translation of the messages of how forest thinks into family therapeutic ritual practices. Eduardo, yeah, I guess, have you been aware of any sort of like those sort of other sort of translations into practice of the work that you did in that book?
Well, there are some interesting translations. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting that I learned about secondhand, actually, from another anthropologist, and then later I became intimately involved in later repercussions of the process, is that there's an avant-garde contemporary classical symphony called How Forests Think, that was directly inspired by the title and the content of the book. And then later I began to collaborate with, her name is Lisa Lim. She's a Chinese-Australian composer, and incredible. If you Google her, Lisa, Liza, Lim, and also you can Google How Forests Think, you can actually hear it online. And then I worked with her and the musicians in the performance of it in Banff, and subsequently have worked with other musicians. And Manadi Ushigwa, most recently we did, there was a performance at Carnegie Hall that Manadi and I were part of, Manadi centrally on stage with the musicians. So that is a really radically and interesting form of translation. Like, how do you actually turn a book into a symphony? In what ways is it just a kind of inspiration for something, or what ways does it actually track some of the argumentations? It was quite interesting. Not similarly, but I think, I don't know exactly how my work precisely would translate or move into, registers of therapy. But of course, the traffic in imagistic and iconic thinking, this is obviously, has huge parallels and is germane to any kind of psychoanalytic tradition, because of how thought works. There's also, and I won't talk about this much, but there's also, of course, in my later work, I've been specifically interested in psychedelics, that is mind manifestation. Of course, the forest is a paramount example of mind manifestation. It thinks, it manifests thought, mind. There's also a whole conversation in psychedelic assisted therapy and psychedelics in traditional contexts, and of course, life as intrinsically psychedelic, where can we but notice it?
Lovely, thank you, Eduardo. So we've had a couple of comments through on the chat. A really interesting one from Maria Fernanda, who notes in relation to that document that you mentioned, Eduardo, the use of the word font instead of resource when talking about the forest. So that kind of interesting sort of translation there for what the Sariaku were intending or not intending to communicate. There's a question from Luis Eduardo about where one can purchase the book in Spanish. I don't know if someone, perhaps Mónica or someone, will be able to share a link to a website or something, or tell us where we can get hold of it. Mónica, would you be able to say something?
Yes, I can put the link somewhere, but it's in the app. The publisher is Abya, and also Hecht, Abya in Ecuador and Hecht in Argentina. It's in a lot of libraries now, at least in Bogota, where you can purchase it, but it's also online. I'll try to put the link there.
Thanks, Mónica.
Okay.
And then, so we're almost out of time, but I do want to give a bit of space just to a final question from Laura in the chat, which is, it's quite an open one, so interesting to see where you guys want to take this. But Laura wants to ask a bit more about dreaming, which has come up a few times, and kind of where it sits in relation to this discussion about communication, transmission, authorship, and translation. I thought that quotation that you had, Jamila, about translation as a way of dreaming outside of oneself was absolutely wonderful. I've noted that down, but I don't know if there's anything else anyone wants to add about where dreaming sits in this network.
I certainly can say something quickly. The work of dreaming is such an interesting thing, because of course what we do when we dream is what we dream, but then we think about our dreaming and we try to apply it to our own lives, and that's a form of translation in which the goal is not to fully to allow the dream to continue to do its dreamlike work in our living everyday lives. It's a form of translation that doesn't domesticate fully the particular logic of dreaming. And I think my sense is that's what Amazonians do. They have a more permeable boundary between the dream world and the waking world, such that the dream world allows people to think and translate in a particular way into the waking world. It's not fully, this sense of like not boxing it up too quickly is super important.
Thanks very much. Mónica or Jamila, is there anything else you guys would like to add? No. Okay. Oh yeah, Mónica.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I was just really trying to look for the link for
don't worry. Yeah, ask you to do too many things at once.
No, so many things. I know we're out of time, but I've just really enjoyed listening to Jamile and Eduardo and their thoughts about translation. It just makes me think about possibilities. I would love to talk with Jamile more about Runa Puma and all the words that you cannot translate. Thinking about translation as a form of that it involves critical thinking. What you don't translate is so important. How to retain the sound, because the melody, as Jamila was saying, is there in the images. It's happening in so many ways, but the sound of the words in Quechua, it has to be there, right? And I mean, so many things to talk about in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I know we're out of time, so I'll just say thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, I'm also conscious of time, but I wanted to say that this was fascinating, and I'm so excited to, continue talking to you, Mónica, about the challenges and the solutions, and conveying the other forms of sense making that are in this book, and the melody, the atmosphere, and I think that this is just the beginning of many interesting conversations, and I feel very, very, very honored, as I said, Eduardo, to, be a conduit for something larger, allowing for something larger to emerge, as you said so beautifully. It's been really, really special to be with you today. So,
yeah, it's a real treat for me. I mean, both you, Jamila, and Mónica have been just so inspiring to see how translation ethnographically done, that is reflecting on the process of it, such that it changes us, enriches the entire process. So I want to thank you for that, for doing that for me.
Well, and I think we would all like to thank the three of you for letting us listen in on that incredibly rich and generative conversation. So yeah, thank you again to all three of you for your presentations, for your wonderful work. I think we've made a powerful case that translation should be more widely recognized as a method of critical thinking. I noticed that Trish put some interesting references in the chat if anyone's interested to follow up. But for now, thank you to our three speakers. Thank you to all of you for joining. I think I can say, although we don't have any concrete plans for the Germination series next year as yet, we are very keen to keep it going. And so we'll reflect on what our theme or focus might be. If you have any suggestions, do get in touch of areas that you think it would be useful for us to focus on. But for now, thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
What a treat.
Thank you. Gracias.